Well, good morning, Connecting Point, and today we are at 1 Samuel in the 11th chapter, and this is a chapter where Saul is recognized as king. But before we explore that, I'd like to go to a table talk to begin with. And you and I might not be kings or queens of nations, but God gives each of us, his followers, a position of influence. How would you describe this in your life? Okay, as we come to chapter 11, we'll just do a brief review of the journey so far up to the monarchy of Israel. At this point in time, as we come to chapter 11, Saul has been secretly or privately anointed as king, and that was in 1 Samuel 10 verse 1. Subsequently, he was publicly proclaimed or acclaimed as king in 1 Samuel 10:24, but up until this point has not acted as the king. And at the end of chapter 10, Israel has a king, but they seem like they don't exactly know how to be a kingdom, including Saul, the newly appointed king. And so after the announcement of Saul being their king, they all went home as instructed by Samuel. And Saul went to his home in Gibeah, where, as we come to chapter 11, we find Saul is still farming. So let's begin by reading chapter 11, and we'll start with the first 3 verses. Nahash the Ammonite went up and besieged Jabesh Gilead, and all the men of Jabesh said to him, "Make a treaty with us, and we will be subject to you." But Nahash the Ammonite replied, "I will make a treaty with you only on the condition that I gouge out the right eye of every one of you, and so bring disgrace on all Israel." The elders of Jabesh said to him, "Give us 7 days so we can send messengers throughout Israel. If no one comes to rescue us, we will surrender to you." So all along on this journey to becoming a monarchy, Israel has been preoccupied by the threat of the Philistines, which is from the southwest of Israel. But in this case, it is a threat from the east, beyond the Jordan River, that emerges in the form of the Ammonites, led by Nahash. So Nahash the Ammonite has taken the Israeli town of Jabesh Gilead, which is also east of the Jordan. And the men, in response, the men of Jabesh offer themselves basically as slaves in exchange for peace. But Nahash's terms for a treaty are much harsher. He requires that the Israelites in Jabesh would have their right eye gouged out. And this was probably a method of disabling or at least hindering the men of Jabesh in terms of ever putting up an effective resistance. And Nahash explicitly declares that he wishes to bring disgrace, or to bring humility, or to humiliate all Israel. The men of Jabesh request from Nahash, they request time to see if anyone could come and save them. And this is where Nahash makes a strategic error. He gave them the time, 7 days, to put out a call for help. And we don't really know why. The scriptures explain Nahash's motivation for this. But it could have been out of arrogance. Perhaps if some people came to rescue the men of Jabesh Gilead, maybe he could conquer them as well and humiliate them. Or maybe it was just foolishness. He just was a foolish leader, and he wasn't able to take advantage of his place at that point, and just to get on with what he wanted to do. But regardless of what all that happened, Nahash gives them this time. So let's go to verse 4 and let's see how this goes. When the messengers came to Gibeah of Saul and reported these terms to the people, they all wept aloud. Just then Saul was returning from the fields behind his oxen, and he asked, "What is wrong with everyone? Why are they weeping?" Then they repeated to him what the men of Jabesh had said. When Saul heard their words, the Spirit of God came powerfully upon him, and he burned with anger. He took a pair of oxen, cut them into pieces, and sent the pieces by messengers throughout Israel, proclaiming, "This is what will be done to the oxen of anyone who does not follow Saul and Samuel." Then the terror of the Lord fell on the people, and they came out together as one. When Saul mustered them at Bezek, the men of Israel numbered 300,000, and those of Judah 30,000. They took the messengers who had come. "Say to the men of Jabesh Gilead, by the time the sun is hot tomorrow, you will be rescued." And when the messengers went out and reported this to the men of Jabesh, they were elated. They said to the Ammonites, "Tomorrow we will surrender to you, and you can do to us whatever you like." The next day Saul separated his men into 3 divisions. During the last watch of the night, they broke into the camp of the Ammonites and slaughtered them until the heat of the day. Those who survived were scattered so that no 2 of them were left together. So what we find here is really the turning point when Israel would begin to behave as a kingdom. This is where Saul transitions from being a farmer to a warrior leader. It's important to note that the transition is dependent on God's presence and influence. And we see the presence of God in 2 ways. The Spirit of God upon Saul. So number 1, the Spirit of God upon Saul. Number 2, the terror or the dread of the Lord that fell on all the people. The Spirit caused Saul to burn with anger. This became his motivation to defend. He was angry, and his motivation. This was his motivation to defend the people of Jabesh Gilead. And the terror of the Lord, or the dread of the Lord, unified the people. This is what brought them together to offer defense to Jabesh Gilead. So you have the presence of God in these 2 ways, the Spirit of God on Saul, and then the fear of the Lord, or the terror, in this case, of the Lord on the people. In this story this is the first time that we see Saul sort of as the leader, acting as the king. And Saul looks like he is off to a good start as king of Israel. First of all, we find that he is open to the Spirit of God, which he has shown, as we've seen in previous weeks, that he is open to the Spirit of God, and the Spirit of God would overwhelm him or come on him. We also see in this that he is still deferring to, or at least including, Samuel as an authority, as when he sends out the pieces of the oxen around the kingdom, he threatens basically anyone who does not follow Saul or Samuel and Samuel. So he's including Samuel in this, which is important in this transition time. The people of Israel responded to Saul's leadership. This is the third thing, that they responded to Paul's leadership, and they followed Saul, and they achieved a great victory. So here we see Saul looking like he's off to a pretty strong start as the leader of Israel. And it's interesting that the turning point for Saul, turning point meaning going from the farmer to the warrior leader, the turning point for Saul is when he learned of the oppression of Jabesh, and then in response being directed by the Spirit of God. So there was this important event that kind of brought Saul to a realization of who he was as a leader and what he's called to. Also was a turning point for the people of Israel. And so this important event of the Ammonites invading Jabesh at Gilead. And this is what kind of brings the kingdom together in response to this tragedy that is about to take place. So this got me thinking about, how do I then take this and apply it to my life, or how would you apply this to your life? And the question I came up with, and I want us to go to a table talk at this point, is what turning points or events, what turning points can you identify in your experience? Can you think of a significant event or a time in your life that caused you to be directed by God's presence in a deeper way? Is there anything that you can point to? So we'll take a few minutes to talk about that, and I'll see you in a couple minutes. Okay, let's go to verse 12 now. And verse 12 picks up the story after the great victory. The people then said to Samuel, "Who was it that asked, 'Shall Saul reign over us?' Turn these men over to us, so that we may put them to death." But Saul said, "No one will be put to death today, for this day the Lord has rescued Israel." Then Samuel said to the people, "Come, let us go to Gilgal, and there renew the kingship." So all the people went to Gilgal, and made Saul king in the presence of the Lord. There they sacrificed fellowship offerings before the Lord, and Saul and all the Israelites held a great celebration. So, in the wake of the victory, it seems the people wanted to celebrate Saul's leadership first by gathering those who were doubters of Saul. And you may remember from the previous chapter, actually in verse 27 of chapter 10, it said, "But some wicked men said, 'How can this guy save us?' And they despised him and did not bring him a gift." So they weren't in favor of Saul being king. But in verse 13, it's actually Saul who diffuses the situation and redirects the credit for victory back to the Lord. And he says, "For this day the Lord has rescued Israel." And this is another part of Saul's good start. He didn't right away take credit for this victory, but he directed people's attention back to the Lord. So even the nation at this point seems to be off to a good start by making offerings to the Lord and having a great celebration, as Samuel had directed them to Gilgal, and let's go reaffirm Saul as king and let's have a celebration. And so they worship, basically, and they celebrate. So Saul seems to be off to a pretty good start, and the nation seems to be off to a pretty good start in this. They have a victory under their belt. They're responding to God, and they're celebrating and giving the Lord credit for this victory. But as we continue in future weeks to follow the events of Saul's reign as king, we will see him falter and we will see him fail. And the thing is this, just because he may have had a good start doesn't guarantee that he would finish well. But in this story of Saul transitioning from farmer to king, we see some important elements in the story that, if they were maintained as a priority, they would have kept Saul and the nation of Israel on the right path. And this brings up this idea that in a Christian's life, some Christians start off really good and then falter and fail as they go along. We've seen Christian leaders who have, risen to places of prominence, but then over time they follow the wrong ways and they don't lead in the way of the Lord, and they end up falling. And we see that example here in Saul. Now, it doesn't have to be that way. I believe that it's entirely possible that if we focus on the right things, that we continue to grow. So what I want you to do with this story of Saul is, what do you see in this account that are keys to Saul's success, his early success? What are the keys to Saul's early success? And then continue that discussion by going, how do these keys translate into your experience? What are the things you see in this account that move Saul, move the nation to victory and off to a good start? What are those keys? And how do we pursue those things? What can we learn from this that would benefit our walk of faith with Jesus Christ? And if you're in a position of leadership, how would that help you to maintain the right path of leadership and to continue to grow? And this is just the beginning, so we're going to look at these traits or these keys that move us toward more of a successful walk with Christ. And we will learn more lessons as we go forward, and sometimes we learn from some of the negative things that happen in Scripture. But today I want us to learn from what were the positive things to take from this that will help us in our walk and to be staying on that right path and not faltering and failing. Israel was off to a good start. Saul was off to a good start. What does that look like? What are the concepts and the ideas and the practices that help us to stay on that path?